Hi, everyone. My name is Karen. No need to be near the mic, or is that okay?
Good.
Okay. So my research is titled The Nature of Compassion in Yoga, illuminating its modern role through an examination of historical texts. And compassion is a key element within many world traditions and religions. So today it is mostly associated with Buddhist thoughts. And modern yoga really emphasizes compassion as a key element, with either little to no reference to historical texts. So really my intention was to bridge that gap. Might be either slow or yeah. Can use that. I let the tech guy go. Can you step on that for a minute? Yeah, I know. Okay. Oh. Or no. We'll do it back. Yeah.
No.
Okay. More?
Good.
Okay. So I've identified two roles of compassion in modern yoga to give us a framework. So the first one is compassion's role in personal healing. And this really comes into the current research of self-compassion and the benefits it has on mental health and well-being. So it's really linked to the mindfulness revolution, mindfulness movement, and mindful self-compassion movement that have really made their way into most aspects of our life, from hospital therapies, military, corporate spaces, and into our yoga spaces eventually. So the second role that I've identified is compassion's role in collective healing. And this really is modern yoga emphasizes turning compassion into action in the social domain. So taking internal practices and turning them into interpersonal tools. And this is, of course, not disassociated from the tradition of yoga and historical figures like Gandhi, but it also really interweaves a lot of modern aspects and a lot of Western aspects like human rights and this intersection between yoga, modernity, and transnationalism. So what is compassion? So it comes from the English word, the Latin root patio, to suffer, and come together. So it's linking together the idea of suffering, compassion, and others. And Sanskrit has many terms that could indicate compassion, and I go through that in my sequence. And a few of those are karuna, kripa, daya, anukrosha, anukampa, which is mainly used in the Buddhist context, and anurishasya. So my research entails going through really key texts to explore the meaning of compassion in the text. And I was looking at the Sanskrit to identify the differences between the terms and look into the nature of compassion. So we'll start. So the Upanishads are texts that are really foundational, and they emphasize the unity between Atman, the individual self, and Brahman, the ultimate truth. And they also emphasize the transformative nature of knowledge. And this raises two questions. And the first is what are the ethical implications of knowledge? And the second is how can ethics exist in a world of non-duality, in a world where there's no distinction between good and bad, in a world which is beyond personality. So the Upanishads, while they do provide a lot of teaching, they don't really provide concise answers to these questions. They plant the seeds that later traditions elaborate upon. So we'll look back to that a little bit later. And the Yoga Sutra, which we heard of today, really foundational classical yoga text, mentions compassion within Yoga Sutra 133. And in the Buddhist context, it brings us the Brahma Vihara. So by cultivating an attitude of maitri, friendliness towards the happy, karuna, compassion towards those in distress, mudita towards those who are virtuous, and upeksha, equanimity towards those who are non-virtuous. And the result is that lucidity arises in the mind. And this refers to a sattva guna or sattvic state of mind, which is really crucial for the mental achievements of yoga. It's important to note that within the context of the Yoga Sutra, the Brahma Viharas come within a series of sutras that are aimed towards the meditative skill or mental stillness. And the result is the samapati state, which is an absorption state. So Buddhist influence on the Yoga Sutras are well established throughout scholarship. And while it is the source in the literature, the origins of the practice of the Brahma Viharas is still quite vague, with some suggesting Jain origins in the reflections of infinity, and others suggest Brahmana sources. But what we do know is that the practice was shared among many traditions. So we know through Buddhist texts that it was really commonly practiced by all traditions, those who affirm the self and those who don't. And in the Buddhist context, the Brahma Viharas are seen as meditative skill, moral cultivation, as well as the characteristic of the enlightened being. So it also emphasizes the connection between metta, maitri, and karuna, compassion. And the text says that metta is really the water that nourishes compassion's roots. And we see that connection in yoga texts as well. So drawing from the Brahma Viharas, from the Buddhist context, we could imply that there are also moral qualities to the Brahma Viharas in the Yoga Sutras, though it's important to come back to the context of the Yoga Sutras and the emphasis on the mental achievement. So the Mahabharata. So Dharma becomes a pivotal concept in the Mahabharata. It is said to be ati sukshma, or extremely subtle. And the narrative of the Mahabharata really explores what constitutes Dharma. And in this context, the ideal of anushamsya becomes prominent. So it literally translates as non-cruelty, and it becomes a crucial component to understanding the nature of compassion in this text. And anushamsya is said to be either a counter or a critique to renouncer tradition, either Shramana or Brahmana, and really their adherence to the absolutism of ahimsa or nonviolence. So anushamsya is said to come as ideal that represents the path of action in the world. And the text repeatedly mentions the term highest dharma, but anushamsya is said to be the highest dharma more than any other ideal in India. And in that context, I translated a chapter from book 13. And book 13 and book 12 include subtales, which are not part of the main narrative. Those are upakayanas. And they are more about Dharma, so they explore the nature of Dharma. And this is a discourse between Yudhishthira and Bhishma. And Yudhishthira is said to be the embodiment of anushamsya in the epic. So he's also said to be the truthful knower of compassion, satyam karuna vedyam. And the story goes like this. So Yudhishthira said, I wish to hear all the characteristics of non-cruelty and moral conduct of devoted people. And Yudhishthira tells him a story. And it is a story about a hunter who goes into the forest to hunt for deer. And he takes poisonous arrows, and while he didn't hunt deer, he accidentally hits a big forest tree. So he accidentally hits a big forest tree. And it turns out that a virtuous parrot lived inside the hollow of that tree. And the parrot didn't leave that tree as the tree began to die and decay from the poison. And the parrot gradually, along with the tree, began to die. He began fasting, he was weak, and he became silent. And then Lord God Indra saw the virtuous parrots, and at first he wondered, how can a bird be engaged in such a high quality of non-cruelty or anushamsya? But then Indra affirmed that anushamsya is an ideal that applies to all beings. So he comes down to earth to talk to this virtuous parrot and ask for the reason why you didn't abandon that tree. And the parrot says, I am devoted to non-cruelty and filled with devotion, bhakti. Compassion and anuprosha is indeed the greatest characteristic of virtue of good people. And compassion always brings joy to good people. It's a beautiful idea or concept that compassion blesses the compassionate, that compassion informs us as well as others. And just a few points to highlight from this narrative. And the first is that the act of hunting itself is not condemned. So hunting for deer is quite a big theme in the Mahabharata. So here, hunting, ahimsa, or nonviolence itself is not seen as absolute. And bhakti, devotion, becomes an important component to the ideal of Anurishantya. And there is a relationship. Surprisingly, bird stories are quite common throughout yoga's literature. And this can be kind of traced back to the Rig Veda, which sets the connection between birds and friendship. And this connection gets a bhakti twist in the Upanishads. So also includes the element of friendliness. And Anurishantya is said to be expandable. So it applies to humans, it applies to animals, and applies to trees. And Anukrosha, compassion, which literally means crying alongside, it says to benefit the self and others. And this really brings an emotional component to compassion in relation to others' suffering. So this tale ends by the parrot. He receives a boon from Indra, and he chooses, of course, to save that tree, which is then sprinkled with nectar and brought back to life. And of course, there are the benefits to the parrot as well. He attains the heavens, the Lord, the God, the world of Indra. So another beautiful narrative text is the Yoga Vashishta. And the Yoga Vashishta is a really pluralistic text. It involves many influences from various traditions, but I'd like to highlight the Advaita Vedanta influence and Mahayana Buddhism influence, particularly the Yogacara school of Buddhism, so mind-only school. So this looks us back to what we encountered in the Upanishads. How can non-duality and ethics exist together? How can moral conduct exist in an unreal world of illusion and unity? And one possible answer to that is that distinction between Advaita Vedanta and the Buddhist school of Yogacara or Madhyamaka. And this is that Advaita Vedanta seeks to awaken us from a dream. Rather, this text is closer to a Buddhist view, which seeks to awaken us into a dream. And it's a different type of seeing, a different type of realization, which really establishes moral conduct throughout the path to liberation and beyond. So this text, the Yoga Vashishta, sets the ideal of a great doer, of a Mahakarta, whose nature is inherently moral. And it's another narrative that I translated. I'm going to need my notes for this one. So this narrative is from book 6, and it explores the path to samadhi through the analogy of a growing tree. So it describes the right conditions for the tree to grow, flourish, and eventually become stable and strong. So Vashishta says, the seed should be watered by the nourishment of the company of good people. So the importance of Sangha community. Thunderstorms and lightning that devastate the field and could destroy the tree are said to manifest in the form of transient enjoyment. And these transient enjoyments should be prevented by steadiness, generosity, compassion, daya, and mantras. And because the seed of the tree was preserved, the seed of meditation comes forth with the quality of discernment, viveka. So as a result, the ground of the mind shines brightly. So this also refers to what we see in the Yoga Sutra in the Brahma Vihara context, a sattva state of mind. And eventually, when the tree is grown, it is said to be thick with a flavor of non-attachment. It does not even tremble by the monkey agitation of raga and desha, of likes and dislikes. And from that appearance, adorned by knowledge, the tree produces branches that are spreading all places far and wide. And these branches of wisdom are said to be truth, equanimity, friendliness, and compassion, karuna. So I'd like to highlight a few points from this narrative as well. And the first is that compassion is mentioned twice. And the first time that compassion is mentioned is described as an instrument or as a tool to counter worldly desires. And it is the moral conduct to grow the seed of meditation and provide the right conditions for the path of liberation. And this is indicated by the term daya. And the second time that we see compassion is when one is no longer swayed by raga and vesha, and it's beyond the ego. And then compassion is a byproduct of wisdom, and it is inherent to the nature of the Mahakarta, of the liberated being. And this is indicated by the term karuna. So this narrative ends with the experience of joy and bliss of resting under the shade of the tree. So while the nature of compassion is not really tied here to the experience of suffering, as we've seen or as we might think about, here it is related to an experience that's coming from the realization of the self as bliss, as fullness, and unity. And there's another beautiful verse from the Yoga Vasishta that ties us back to the question of what are the ethical implications of this transformative knowledge. And it goes, the world with all its being is one. From stupidity, one's essence is not reached. From knowledge, one speaks of two mutual. Knowledge bestows friendliness. And as I mentioned, friendliness might be the foundation, the water that nourishes compassion's roots. So Hatha Yoga text, medieval period. So most texts that address moral conduct really follow the frame of Ashtanga Yoga, so the 8 limbs, and therefore their guidelines are really encapsulated within the yamas. And the yamas change in numbers throughout centuries, but the most common in the Hatha Yoga period becomes a list of 10 yamas. So, and these lists of 10 include either the term kripa or daya. So both these terms can be translated as either pity, tenderness, or compassion. So the first kind of Hatha Yoga text that mentions a list of 10 is the Sharada Tilaka, the 12th century Shaiva Tantra text. And here it is mentioned the term kripa. And I'd just like to point that here, perhaps in a Shaiva context, in the theistic context, kripa mostly denotes the term grace. So that might just indicate the origins of the text. Since later texts, the Vasishta Samhita, Yoga Yajnavalkya, and all the way into later Upanishads really switch the term to daya. Compassion is more clearly compassion. And the Hatha Pradipika, the 15th century compilation, perhaps some of us know that it does include a list of yamas, but those really weren't there in the original manuscripts, and they were inserted later, probably influenced by the Jyotsna or the 19th century commentary by Brahmananda. And what it really shows us that by the 19th century, this list of 10 yamas was widely accepted, widely acknowledged, and was even read back into text. So where does all of this lead us? So the text that I kind of went through could be distinguished into 2 categories mostly. And those are texts that are world affirming or world negating. And this really correlates to the audience of the text as either renouncers or householders. And so we see that Upanishad, Yoga Sutra, and Hatha Yoga texts mostly emphasize renunciation and the achievements of mental stillness. And the yamas in this context can be seen as a prerequisite to the aesthetic goal. And Hatha texts, while they're not really consistent about their audience, are really a time where the establishment of aesthetic orders took place. So narrative texts like the Mahabharata or the Yoga Vasishta appeal to a broader audience. So they increase your accessibility to their teachings and the practices. So they really accordingly emphasize the teachings of pro-social values. And the Yoga Rahasya is a text attributed to Krishnamacharya, the sage Natamuni, but it's probably written by Krishnamacharya himself. And Krishnamacharya, the father of modern yoga, really increased the accessibility to the practices of yoga. And he highlights in this text the therapeutic applications of yoga. And this text states, knowing that Ashtanga yoga removes diseases, the student must learn from the teacher what is appropriate for him. He must then practice with compassion, daya, for himself, as well as for the sake of others. And I found this verse really interesting as it brings us closer to the modern understanding of compassion in yoga. It kind of flips the script and emphasizes self-compassion, what we don't really see in historical texts. And of course, self-compassion is inherently part of compassion. So there's a little bit of a switch here. So modern yoga, we can definitely say, is no longer a renouncer's practice. It is often seen as a tool to live a fuller life and really enhance the ways we relate to the world. And this often reflects the common understanding of yoga as union today. So modern yoga really places compassion at the heart of yoga for its householder tradition. And this echoes what we saw throughout the century, this correlation between the increasing or growing importance of compassion within a text, within a tradition, to the growing demand of the householder accessibility. And before we wrap up, I just want to touch upon these the terms for compassion, and I go deeply into that in my thesis. But just to note that karuna indicates usually a Buddhist influence on the text. It implies a higher state of compassion, and it often comes together with maitri, with friendliness. Daya usually refers to a cultivated compassion, one that is to be practiced on the path towards enlightenment, as we see as part of the yamas and in the Yoga Vishishta. And kripa usually translates pity, like in the Mahabharata, and grace. And anushamsya, this ideal that becomes crucial for the understanding of compassion, includes within it subsumes compassion and bhakti. And anukrosha is compassion in relations to other suffering, so more an emotional component. So the nature of compassion is really diverse, just as yoga itself, the different traditions and the different intentions. And while modern yoga is really influenced by this intermingling between Buddhism, modernity, really, hopefully I was able to demonstrate that compassion is widely embedded within yoga's literature, and that it really correlates and represents the movement between renunciation to householders and from exclusivity to accessibility. And hopefully this exploration will enable modern practitioners to sustain a connection to historical texts while continuing to shape modern yoga for our contemporary needs. So thank you.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, everyone, and to all of our graduates. I just, listening to Karen, her story from the Yoga Vasishta, about the seeds and sprinkling them, it reminds me when I first met with all of our speakers today in the fall, and they told me about their ideas, and many of them had many different seeds, and we sort of watered them, and we saw which ones grew. And I'm just so proud of everybody who presented today, and what an amazing job they've done in such a short amount of time, really growing these sturdy trees, and really with that sprinkling of friendliness, of compassion, and of community. Even though we were largely online most of the time, it's amazing to me how much everybody has supported each other and grown together. So we will now have a private ritual to celebrate the graduates. But first, let's please give everybody another round of applause.